Hi, this is Mr. Kumar. In the last video, we have learned about the structure of the cell membrane. In this, we are going to learn about the types of transport across the cell membranes. So let's start. So there are two types of transport: passive and active. So if you look for the passive, what does that mean? In this passive, there is no energy required. And in active, it requires energy in the form of ATP. So the passive is of two types. One is diffusion. So diffusion is a random movement of particles. And if you look for that example, you can see how the oxygen and carbon dioxide is exchanged in our process called as respiration. So we inhale oxygen during the process and exhale carbon dioxide, and that process is through diffusion. So diffusion is random movement of particles. So another type of diffusion is osmosis. So osmosis is nothing but it's a kind of diffusion of water across the semi-permeable membrane. One of the examples of that you can have is the movement of the water across the semi-permeable membrane can be hypotonic, hypotonic, and isotonic. We are going to discuss in detail. So another form of passive transport is facilitated diffusion. So it's a specific type of diffusion in which we use proteins for the transportation of various materials. And one of the examples for facilitated diffusion is glucose transport. So these were the passive transport like diffusion, facilitative diffusion, and osmosis. And talking about the active transport is in which you require energy in the form of ATP. And you use proteins and ATP for the active transport. One of the common example which you're going to learn about the active transport is sodium and potassium pump. So we are going to discuss more in detail about that. Talking about the cell also require large molecules to move across the membrane. And when you're moving large molecules or the moving big particles including organism across the cell, those processes are endocytosis and exocytosis. So this was the summary of the transport. So let's get started. So the first type of passive transport is the simple diffusion. Simple diffusion is it does not require any energy, and the molecules move from area of high concentration to low concentration. One of the examples for simple diffusion is if you spray a perfume in one corner of a classroom, you're going to smell it at the other corner of the classroom. How does that happen? Because the molecules of the perfume, they can travel from one corner of the classroom to the other corner of the classroom through simple diffusion. So they move from the area of high concentration where you have sprayed, and gradually it moves to the area of the low concentration. So in simple diffusion, you do not require any energy. So as you can see, that diffusion is a passive process, which means there is no requirement of energy, and it makes the molecules to move from the concentration of high concentration to low concentration. And how these molecule moves, because they have a kind of kinetic energy. So when we are talking about the movement of the various substances like water across the cell, we are talking about the cell membrane. So when we are talking about the cell membrane, there can be a movement from high concentration to low concentration. So what is the thing which is moving from high concentration to the low concentration? And that thing is the solute. So solute in a cell moves from high concentration to a low concentration through a cell membrane. Osmosis. So what's osmosis? Osmosis is a diffusion of water across the membrane, and it moves from the high water potential. High water potential means where the concentration of water is high and there is a low concentration of solute, to the low water potential where the concentration of water is low and the concentration of solute is high. So in this picture you can see initially it started with a high concentration of water and it started moving to a low water potential. So it was through a semi-permeable membrane, and when you see the final state, on both sides the concentration of water you can see is equal. So osmosis is nothing but diffusion of water across the membrane. And how does the water moves? Water moves from a high water potential. That means where the concentration of or where the quantity of water is high, it moves to the low water potential. So you can see these yellow dots, they represent the water molecules, and you can see initially the upper box was having more water potential, and gradually it passed through this semi-permeable membrane to make the concentration equal. So that is osmosis. So let's see more in detail the diffusion of water across the membrane. So if you can see here, this is the membrane, and these are the water molecule, and these green are the solute. So you can see which side is having more of water potential. So you can always say this side, which is to your left, is having more water potential. But if you look at the solute is more towards the right. So this water is going to move across the semi-permeable membrane from a high water potential to a low water potential. And opposite, it's if you can see where the concentration of solute is high, it's high on this side. So the water potential is going to be high on this side. So water moves from a high water potential to a low water potential. So talking about the water and the solid both, so the high water potential, and it moves to the low water potential where there's a high solute concentration. Aquaporins. What are aquaporins? Aquaporins are nothing but it allows the water molecules to pass through. So these are kind of proteins. You can see they're the water channels. So the water channels, they are made up of the proteins, and they are kind of protein pores which are used during the osmosis to move the water molecules. So aquaporins are nothing but they are the water channels which allows the water molecules to pass through, and they are also kind of protein pores. So talking about the movement of the water, so there can be three situations. Situation 1, if we are taking an example of cell, if the concentration of water outside the cell and inside the cell are equal, then that solution is called as isotonic, and there will be no net movement across the semi-permeable membrane. So the concentration of water across the cell, outside the cell and inside the cell are equal. So there is no exchange of water, and there is equal amount of entering or leaving. So the shape of the cell will remain intact or original. Talking about the hypertonic solution. So when you're talking about the hypertonic solution, let's take an example. If you put the cell into a distilled water, so in that distilled water, the concentration of the water will be more outside, and so what will happen is the water is going to move from outside to inside the cell, and it will make the cell bigger and bigger because the water is moving inside. And what will happen is at one point of time the cell is going to burst, and that process is called as cytolysis. So take another scenario. In that scenario, if we keep the cell in a salt water, and what will happen to that? So if you see, if you keep that into a salt water, the solute, that is the salt, the concentration of the salt is higher outside the cell, and the concentration of water in the cell is high. So what will happen is the water inside the cell is going to leave towards a lower concentration. So inside the cell the concentration was more of the water, so it will leave the cell towards the outside. So what will happen is the condition called as plasmolysis, and this is going to be a hypertonic solution. So let's recap. In isotonic solution, nothing happens to the cell. In hypertonic solution, cytolysis happens. That means due to the movement of the water inside the cell bursts. In hypertonic solution, when the concentration of water is more inside the cell, and due to which it moves from the high water potential to a low water potential, the water is going to leave the cell and it's going to shrink, and that process is called as the plasmolysis, and that solution is called as the hypertonic solution. So these are some of the pictures of the red blood cells keeping in the isotonic, hypertonic and hypertonic solutions. So if you see in isotonic solution, there is no change. In hypertonic solution, the cell is going to burst because the water is going to get into the cell. In hypertonic solution, the water leaves the cell because the water moves from high water potential, which was inside the cell, and it leaves the cell towards the outside. So the cell is going to shrink. So that is a hypertonic solution. So talking about the passive transport, it's a simple diffusion, does not require energy. The molecules move from high to low concentration. The example is oxygen or water diffusing into a cell and a carbon dioxide diffusing out. So this is the passive transport, and there is one specific type of passive transport which is a facilitated diffusion. It does not require energy and uses a transport proteins to move high to low concentration, and the example is glucose or amino acids moving from the blood into a cell. So when we are talking about the transport proteins can be of two types. One is channel protein and the other one is the carrier protein. What's the channel proteins? Channel proteins are embedded in the cell membrane and have a pores for material to cross. So if you remember the cell membrane structure, you saw some of the proteins embedded in the membrane, and those were the channel proteins and the carrier proteins. So channel proteins are embedded in the cell membrane and have a pores for materials to cross. Another type of transport protein are the carrier proteins, which can change the shape to move the material from one side to the membrane to the other. So you can see the example of facilitated diffusion here. So these are the channel protein which are helping the various molecules to move through. So molecules will randomly move through the pores in the channel